Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone, the alternate history podcast. It's Dylan in the host chair today, at least for the beginning, but I'm very soon going to turn this over because we have a little bit of a special occasion. But before we get to that, I want to introduce our hosts for this evening. I have, in no particular order with me today, I have Kai McAllister. Say hello.
Hey, everyone. Excited to be back for another episode of A Fork in Time and very excited for today's episode and guest.
Yes, and we also have Evan Buck, and I will let him introduce himself and our guest, who we had to kind of take a hammer and a socket wrench to the what if machine today because I had to jerry rig a rumble seat on the back for our guest. So, Evan, how's it going?
Hey, everyone. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan. And here with me today, I am very excited to have an eminently qualified scholar of history with us today. Joining our, usually amateurish Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, like sort of approach to the backwaters of history. But with me today is an esteemed colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Lawrence W. Reed. Now, that is the only time I'll refer to him as Dr. Lawrence W. Reed, because as he will typically say to you, he will say, "Call me Larry." So, Larry, how about you introduce yourself and give a little background?
Okay, thank you, Evan. It's a pleasure to be with you guys, and this is going to be fun. I look forward to discussing history and what might have happened if certain things had gone in different directions. I've been interested in history since at least high school. I had some very good history teachers back at that time. But my first interest has always been, since those years, the promotion of individual liberty. And I got into this movement to advance the rights and the property and the persons of free people, largely from an anti-communist angle, because I was upset when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968. Well, I went on from earning my undergraduate degree at Grove City College and graduate degree at Slippery Rock State University, both in Pennsylvania, to becoming a college professor for 7 years. That was from 77 to 84. And in all those 42 years since, I have run think tanks, 3 of them total, first in Idaho for 3 years, and then the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Michigan for 21 years. And from 2008 to 2019, the Foundation for Economic Education. Now, I retired as president of FEE, that third think tank, in 2019, but I'm still effectively full-time as president emeritus, but it means that I get to do what I most enjoy, which is to write and to speak. And most of the time, what I write and speak about is history, sometimes maybe with an economic spin to it, but primarily history is my first love.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Larry, for that introduction. And something that I also would like to note as we start delving into our topic for today is you spent some time as, I believe, an independent journalist, actually, in
Yes.
communist Poland. When exactly was that again?
There was a time when I was running 2 of those think tanks that I mentioned, that I pursued an interest I have in freelance journalism. And my first mission was to go behind the Iron Curtain to explore underground anti-communist movements in places like Poland. First visit to that country was 1986, before the big changes of 89 that brought the downfall of communism. But I also did work in half a dozen visits to Nicaragua during the 1980s, during the Sandinista Contra war period, also in Mozambique and Southeastern Africa, and other Iron Curtain countries at the time. So I have a keen interest in those parts of the world, or did. And so, yeah, I went there and spent time with the underground in each place.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure we'll get a little bit more into that background with the topic that we are going to be discussing today. Probably because of your humility. I'm noting you are not mentioning the fact that you were actually recently awarded the Grand Cross Award from the President of Poland in 2023. So I'd like to think that they're pretty big fans of you. That's kind of the equivalent of like the Presidential Medal of Freedom, like the highest civilian honor that can be given to someone in the United States. So obviously the people of Poland respect you and the work that you did in support of the movement for freedom. With that in mind, and the last thing I'm going to throw in as well is, for me personally, as a history buff, history fan, we talk a lot on our show, or we make brief mention of the Overton window.
Yes.
And shifting that, like in politics and in history. And Larry, you're very familiar with that because the late Joseph P. Overton, who developed that concept, was actually senior vice president at your think tank, the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, in, I think, like the mid 1990s. And I think you were still running that think tank during that time, right?
Yes, I hired Joe and ultimately made him senior vice president. He became my best friend of all time. Went to some 22 countries with him. I was best man at his wedding. Wonderful guy, best friend I think I'll ever have, and a genius when it came to advancing ideas of individual liberty. He died, unfortunately, 22 years, almost 23 years ago, in a plane crash at the age of 43.
Wow. Wow. Pretty incredible life lived there for sure.
Yeah.
So, with all the references that we've made and like oblique references, I'll start getting us into the what did and the topic that we're going to be covering today. So, we're going to take the what if machine not too far back in history, back in like the late 1970s, early 1980s. And the place is going to be in Eastern Europe. And most of our episode is specifically going to be focusing on the theater in Poland. And at this point in time, in the 1980s time frame, there were some movement afoot with regards to the Soviet Union, their invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Larry, in the what we often refer to as the pre-podcast, our pre-podcast discussion, which we make reference to literally every show. We can't go a show without it. But he mentions that like late 1970s, mid to late 1970s was probably can be seen as like the high water mark for collectivist, communist rule in countries. There's a lot of expansion going on. Like the Vietnam War, had ended in favor of the communist guerrillas there, the Viet Cong. So then, there's a lot of domestic issues, economic issues with free market countries, the United States, inflation, all of this kind of stuff. So like late 1970s was probably the high water mark for what we would call like collectivist, communist styles of government. The Soviets had quashed movements in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia in the 50s and the 60s. The leader of the Soviets had articulated the policy of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was, kind of like with the Monroe Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine was basically, we can mess around in any of the Eastern Bloc countries. If they start falling out of our orbit, we can do that anytime we want. Well, what seemed to be their high watermark in the late 1970s was actually probably, in fact, almost definitely was the start of the beginning of the end. Because, as I'm sure a lot of our listeners are very familiar with, the age-old, time-honored quote from The Princess Bride goes something like this: "Never get involved in a land war in Asia, and never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line." The Soviets decided unwisely to pursue a land war in the graveyard of empires, of all places, Afghanistan. And it seemed to be going decently for them at first, but then over the course of the next few years, things really, really went sideways. Brezhnev passed on and passed the torch to an individual, Andropov, who was previously the head of the Russian KGB. So we have a little bit of upheaval going on here. In Poland, we have an individual by the name of General Wojciech Jaruzelski. I hope I got the pronunciation there pretty good. In the pre-podcast, we also mentioned that this is where the beloved internet meme term Wojak actually comes from, this Eastern European name. So from now on, dear listeners, if I don't refer to him by Jaruzelski, I will be referring to him as General Wojak, because that is what I want to do. Chris, when you're listening to the show in post-production, if you do not have a Wojak with like a Polish communist hat on as the picture for the episode, I may lead a solidarity uprising against you. Just saying. But anyway, so General Wojak Jaruzelski, he was the de facto leader of the Polish People's Republic from 1981 until 1989. And he was the military dictator under martial law from 13th of December 1981 until July 22nd, 1983. He had some background serving in the Red Army in World War II. He worked in labor camps in Kazakhstan. He had fled to the Baltic states after the German-Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. That worked out for him okay until the Soviets annexed the Baltic states in 1940. So it was kind of like a frog jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, or however that expression goes, for poor General Wojak. But he was able still nonetheless to rise up through the ranks in the Polish military, and he was able to work his way up through the communist ranks as well, until he finally seized power in 1981. Now, I made reference to Solidarity. Solidarity is the name of a big burgeoning labor union that was founded in August of 1980. Chris, I'm sure, is going to very much appreciate this for our other co-hosts, and mainly for Larry's benefit. Chris actually works quite a bit in his day-to-day job with labor unions. But Solidarity was a trade union started in August 1980 at the Lenin shipyard. And so, Larry, make sure I get this pronunciation right. It's the city name Gdansk.
Yes.
Gdansk.
Shipyard on the Baltic. Yes.
Yes, perfect. So it started in the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, Poland in 1980. And in 1981, August of 1981, at the peak of this labor union's popularity, it had membership that numbered 1/3 of the total working population, 10 million strong, and about 1/4 of the total population of Poland. So that's basically, like, for context of the United States, it's basically like saying, we have like 330 million people. So like that's saying like in the upwards of like maybe 80, 90 million-ish people, I want to say, participating in a labor union in a political movement. Like that would be wild. Like we didn't even have like 80 million people, I think, vote for one of the presidential candidates in the last election, which was massive turnout election. So this is huge. Like the scale of Solidarity cannot be understated. So things weren't going super great for the Polish communists at this point. They got Solidarity, they got food shortages, rationing, bread lines, labor strikes, foreign creditors they were deeply indebted to. Things weren't going super hot for them. With Solidarity breathing down Jaruzelski's neck, he was pretty frightened by the possibility of things unraveling very quickly. He was most acutely concerned with the possibility of a Soviet invasion of Poland. So he decided, after putting in some phone calls to the Soviets and asking them for some help, asking them for some assistance, the Soviets basically said, "No, Wojak, you figure this out on your own." He decided to declare martial law. The Brezhnev Doctrine was kind of officially dead at this point because the Soviets were too busy getting more embroiled in Afghanistan. They didn't want to open up another possible front and get their hands dirty. So they wanted the Poles to figure it out for themselves. They wanted the Poles to figure out how to screw on the light bulb and see how many Poles it would take to do it. Okay, I'm not the one who's usually going to be doing like the Pollock jokes here. That's kind of Dylan's role, but I just wanted to throw that out there for everyone's benefit. Um, so we have martial law. Um, you know, General Wojak was able to kind of establish deeper control, deeper political repression. And although it ended in 1983, the repression aspect of it, the political repression of Solidarity, continued until, well into the late 80s until elections were able to be held. It's kind of a little bit of oversimplification of how it panned out in our timeline. So Larry, if you want to opine a little bit on, the rest of the timeline, fill in any holes that you think would benefit our listeners to understand about the what did before we go into the what might happen. I'll yield the floor to you for a little bit.
Okay, I think maybe the most important thing to point out is, aside from what you mentioned, that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79 was maybe the high watermark of the Soviet Empire. It was all downhill for them from there. It's very apparent now, even President Reagan at the time saw it, that the Soviet Union and its satellite countries were in the very late stage of decay. They had become a sclerotic empire with aged, incompetent leaders. The original motivations that prompted the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and animated it for a number of years, that was all gone. These were new generations of people, even in the leadership in the Soviet Union by the mid 80s, who they were more interested in, what works, not what is ideologically sound. And so they were more pragmatic. But they were dealing with a situation that was on the road to collapse, irrespective of any events that we now know happened. I don't know when it might have happened if certain things had been different, but I don't think that the Soviet Empire had much longer to exist by the time President Reagan was elected in 1980. I think they'd have been gone, even if Carter had won that election. I think the Soviets might have been gone within the next 20 years anyway.
Yeah, certainly. And also one thing you mentioned in the pre-podcast that I will throw in here as well, is what animated Solidarity for a big part of that was in 1979, the Catholic Pope John Paul II had visited Poland against the wishes of like the ruling government. And it was kind of like
his homeland, by the way.
Yes.
First non-Italian pope and the first Polish one, first non-Italian pope in 450 years.
Yeah, exactly. And so he visited. It was kind of like when Metallica had a free concert in Moscow, like after, I don't know if it was like before or after the fall of the Soviet Union, but it was a free concert. But even though it was a free concert, still the fact that you could have millions of people, just like a sea of people just showing up for a Western, heavy metal band that many of them probably never heard of or had like some like backwater exposure to. Very impressive. So John Paul II kind of got a Polish version of the Metallica reception there. Like he was super popular. Of course, it's his home country. So he had the benefit of being the home crowd favorite. But his I don't know, was it a homily or I'm not Catholic personally, so I don't know what that's called, whatever he preached or whatever he did as the Pope. As a Pope of memes, Kai, I should know this better. I had to throw that in there. That's an inside joke I'll explain in the post podcast.
Being from Poland, it was impossible for the Polish government to deny him the possibility of revisiting his homeland. So,
yeah.
But the Polish communist government tried to regulate who could see him and how big the crowds would be, but they utterly failed. The central square in Warsaw and the same in Krakow had, it was well over 1 million people in both places that turned out in spite of all the attempts of the communist regime to keep people away. They turned out just wall to wall. And John Paul II told them, this was the most memorable phrase that he used. He said, "Be not afraid." Now, to you and me, that may not sound all that important, but Poles knew what he meant. They took it to mean, the Pope is telling us it's time to resist. We shouldn't be afraid. We should do what's right. If that means taking some risks, he's with us. And that led directly to the formation of Solidarity within a matter of a few months.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have spent almost 20 minutes on establishing the what did, because I think in order for this topic in particular, with me and Larry having a lot of background on this, I think it's good that our audience knows all of this leading up to the fork that we're going to be talking about. And so the fork that we're going to be discussing is, what if, rather than declare martial law in December of 1989, General Jaruzelski, in fact, chooses not to. Sorry, what's that?
I think you said 89.
Did I say 89? My bad.
Yeah,
81.
81.
81. 81 and 89, I'm going to probably confuse a couple times. So thank you for correcting me. So rather than declare martial law in December of 1981, General Wojak chooses not to do so. So I'm going to throw it to the other co-hosts because I've been yapping for a bit. I have my thoughts, of course, on how this could possibly happen, what the historical basis for this alternate fork might be. But I'll leave it to you guys to kind of start discussing that and seeing what the implications of that might be.
So I think that the first thing that we should do is establish what may become a burgeoning debate on this episode, which is whether the lack of declaration of martial law on the part of General Wojak Jaruzelski precipitates a Soviet invasion. The Soviets are very fond of invading their Warsaw Pact counterparts, if to put it gingerly. They invade Hungary, they invade Czechoslovakia. There's no hesitance for invading other countries, although at this point there may be. And so one thing that we talked about in the pre-podcast is whether Poland would have the same fate as Hungary and Czechoslovakia, whether it would be invaded by the Soviet Union as a result of Jaruzelski stopping short of declaring martial law. And I think we had some differing opinions on this, which is excellent. We love that. So what do we think would happen if in the immediate aftermath? How would the Kremlin respond to Jaruzelski being reticent to declare martial law? Let's start there.
So my first inclination is I tend to lean more on the side of I do think the Soviets invade in some sense, but my question is, okay, at what point does that happen? Because behind the scenes, Jaruzelski was trying to get that as his backstop the whole time with the martial law. So if for whatever reason, say the unrest doesn't, continues to escalate or whatever, I think if you start getting into the spring of 82 or even, kind of the winter of 82, then I think you would start seeing after a couple of months, the Soviets might first, some KGB or some Spetsnaz, and then maybe a more full-born thing. Because the other thing that the Soviets are going to be wary of is, to them, this is very reminiscent of what happened in almost exactly a decade to the month earlier. In December of 1970, the Poles had a little uprising. They cleaned house of about half of the upper leadership of the People's Republic of Poland. So the Soviets, I can't help but think, are going to be having some acid flashbacks, and they're going to be kind of worried about, okay, is this going to look too much like the last time? Is it not? What's going on? But my personal inclination is I suspect, at least at the beginning, it's going to be kind of tepid. And only once you start getting into 82, depending on how the situation goes in Poland, do they start really considering what their military reaction is going to be. But that's kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah. And I think I would probably tend to agree with that. And I think there's a couple of factors to keep in mind here about Poland that, differs a little bit from, Czechoslovakia or Hungary. It's a much larger country. It has what I would argue a much more organized opposition than either of those countries did. And, we're also keeping in mind the inflection point that the Soviet leadership is on at this point. Brezhnev is still in power in when martial law is declared. He dies in November of 1982. So we have a new leader, Andropov, who is, like I said, the former head of the KGB. And for me personally, I feel like he would still want to go for a covert approach, pushing hard on Jaruzelski to act decisively, trying to not get their hands dirty, trying to get the Poles to handle it themselves. Jaruzelski very deeply feared the prospect of a Soviet invasion, so that's why he declared martial law to begin with, to prevent this. But with all that in mind, difference between Brezhnev and Andropov only lasts 2 years. This is what I like to call, that nobody remembers the two leaders, like in between Brezhnev and Gorbachev. We got Andropov and we have, I think, Chernenko, I want to say his name was. Yeah. Yeah. And so I call them the crusty old dudes. These are the crusty old dudes that don't last long and die pretty quickly, and that paves the way for a more reform-minded Gorbachev to come into power. So be that as it may, depending on the particulars of the situation of what happens in Poland, I don't think that Andropov would be, outright opposed to an invasion if things got bad enough. But I think his preferred style of leadership and working covertly, because again, KGB guy, he might prefer to work more applying that covert pressure, almost like more like a special ops kind of scenario. But then again, I did just think of the fact that Putin is also a former KGB guy, and we see what he's done with the war in Ukraine. So that might mean Andropov might be a little bit more inclined to go militarily. I know, Larry, you had some personal opinions on this.
Yeah, I think until Gorbachev, who came to power in March of 85, all you had were these old school, hardline communist leaders, none of whom would have had any compunction about invading if they thought things in neighboring Poland or any of the other satellite countries had gotten out of control. Gorbachev is a little different breed, but he doesn't come to power until March of 85. Andropov, if he thought that Jaruzelski was failing to keep Poland under control, he would have invaded. Chernenko after him, he was kind of half out of his mind at that point, but I think he would have had enough marbles. He would have ordered an invasion too, if anything like an out of control situation had developed. But don't forget, we also had something that was not present and was very powerful, but was not present way back in 1970. And that is by 1981, you had Ronald Reagan as the president of the US, you had Margaret Thatcher in Britain as the prime minister, and you had a Polish anti-communist pope in the Vatican. And we now know that the three of those leaders worked together and separately to help undermine communist rule in Eastern Europe. Reagan, right from the start, labeled the Soviet Union the evil empire. And behind the scenes, he was supporting dissidents in all those countries. This was a significant pressure on an increasingly sclerotic Soviet Union. And so they had to, in Moscow, they had to be thinking, oh my gosh, everybody's coming after us. We're, our satellite countries are falling apart. America and the West seem to be united for the first time in who knows how long in trying to stop what we want to do. So this was immense pressure. At the same time, their economies were falling apart.
Yeah, for sure. Kai, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that just given the history of the Soviet Union and the propensity of these old school, Soviet leaders like Brezhnev, Andropov, etc., I think it's highly likely that if we saw something similar to, or if we saw Jaruzelski showing reticence to declare martial law and not willing to impose martial law on a people that were, as you said at the beginning of the episode, you have arguably a third of the population in open ideological rebellion against the regime. It's very difficult to look at that and say, well, if the leader of that country is not willing to do this, we're going to have to step in because we're going to lose control, right? Let's also not forget that Poland, we talked about this as well in the pre-podcast, which is the DDR under Honecker is kind of seen as the jewel of the Soviet Union. It's probably one of the most successful countries in the Soviet Union, and right next to it is Poland. So you can imagine a situation where
I think you meant Eastern Germany.
Did I say West Germany?
Yeah, you said Poland twice.
Oh, I'm sorry. East Germany. Yeah, East Germany is the jewel and one of the most successful countries in the Soviet Union, and right next to it is Poland. And so we can imagine a situation where the Soviet Union is going to become very worried that if you have Poland start to bubble up without any sort of downward pressure on them, that's going to very quickly spread to the left and go to Germany. And so just based off of proximity, Poland is very strategically important, such that I think the Soviet Union would act quickly to defend it or to continue to subjugate it.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think we mostly are in agreement, actually, because Kai made reference to a possible debate that would happen. And I will just say for the listeners' sake and perspective, my document that I wrote on this topic was more focused on, and we can still talk about this as a possibility for sure, because I think it might come in stages. And so there might be an inflection point where what I'm about to say would be more relevant. But my take, both my own personal take and also when I threw this to AI to possibly, contemplate the possibility, both of us kind of took this idea that, Andropov might not have wanted to, militarily invade right away, but he would still be, really trying to be the puppet master, control things behind the scenes, really make sure that Poland is not going to collapse. I think that if the regime in Poland collapses or is almost on the precipice of collapsing, that's the highest chance of a Soviet invasion happening for sure. But I do think it would probably come in stages. And so we can talk about that now, actually, because, I think with most all of us in agreement that the Soviets would invade if things got, too chaotic too quickly. In the kind of interim period, no martial law happens. Larry mentioned Reagan in the presidency, Thatcher in Britain. We have NATO, of course, like being a thing, a big deal. We have, of course, the covert support of the Catholic Church, the covert support of the CIA, who used to be ran by who is now the vice president of the U.S. at this point, George Bush. So he has his hands on this too. To me, I would like to think that Reagan himself, he's going to have no problem at all in becoming involved in foreign affairs, standing up to the Soviet Union. That was Star Wars, all of that. That is what defines Ronald Reagan's foreign policy outlook.
Evan, if I could just add to reinforce what you said, it was a famous moment when someone, I don't recall who it was, asked President Reagan, this was early in his first term, what is your strategy going to be with regard to the Soviet Union? And he said, very simple, they lose, we win.
Yeah, exactly. So that was his mentality. That was his mindset. And Larry, for your benefit, maybe after the show, I'll send you this one. Chris and I did a what if Ronald Reagan had actually joined the Communist Party early on in his career. I think that's a fascinating one that I think you'll find personally very interesting because yeah, Reagan was courted to join the Communist Party when he wasn't very ideologically, politically, involved yet. Reagan was
Maybe
a
Jimmy
liberal.
Stewart would have saved us then. Another pretty good actor.
Yeah, so Reagan, of course, he was a liberal, Hollywood liberal for most of his career, and then he became more of the, what we now know as the Reagan Revolution, Reagan conservative person. But for a while, he was actually rejected from being part of the Communist Party because they thought he was too dim-witted and couldn't hold a political thought for more than 20 minutes, which I think is very funny to say about who ended up becoming the president of America.
Yeah, he was always underestimated, and he was happy to be so because he knew that it put him in charge.
Yeah. And I will never get over the fact that, like, in Back to the Future, they talk about how, oh, yeah, Ronald Reagan is president. And they're like, Ronald Reagan, the actor? just we forget sometimes. We tend to think now in the modern context, oh, yeah, Reagan, president of the US. But that was like unheard of. That was just crazy. Yeah, he was governor of California, but most people thought of him as a famous actor. So that all in mind, Reagan, we think of the Reagan presidency now a lot of times, from a historical perspective, not really a political ideological perspective, but just from the numbers, like we see, and we think of Reagan's presidency as both standing up to the Soviets and with economic success at home. But this, again, keep in mind, this is early in the Reagan presidency. We're just coming off of the Carter presidency, with the hyperinflation in the 70s. Reagan's going to be dealing with the savings and loan crisis soon in the early 80s. There's still a lot of inflation. There's still a lot of economic messes domestically that he has to clean up. So we don't have the backdrop of what most perceive as the successes of the Reagan presidency having happened yet.
This is not the Top Gun late 80s Reagan yet. This is right. Still kind of finding his way through the wilderness.
Yes,
and I think
exactly.
The other thing is, we also have to keep in mind what the Soviet, not necessarily premiership, but the Politburo's perspective is going to be on their intervention in Poland, because the other elephant that we've successfully hidden in Central Asia up until now is the invasion of Afghanistan. And once you start getting into 82, you're already hearing from Soviet defectors comparisons to the US and Vietnam. Like, this thing's only been going for 3 years, and they can already see the writing on the wall.
They've already screwed the pooch pretty badly.
So you have to wonder, at least in the Politburo level, when they're doing some of their geostrategic planning, are they going to be okay, at least at first, pulling troops from what they're trying to do in Afghanistan before they really realize the writing on the wall? Because Afghanistan and Poland, structurally, from a intelligence and military operations perspective, are very different theaters. Poland has been a communist country. It's already got KGB. It's already got its own secret intelligence. I can imagine if the Soviets are worried about the impact on Germany, the Stasi is probably going to be knocking, the last thing the Poles want, more Germans coming in from the West. But I'm sure the Stasi is going to be making some inroads, at least in the COINTEL part of things, that the Soviets, I'm sure, probably would do first. Because the Soviets are also going to know, as soon as we send troops in, that's when the Americans are going to start getting scary and making noises on top of everything else.
Well, yeah, don't forget that what really turned the war in Afghanistan against the Soviets was Reagan's decision to supply the Mujahideen, the Afghan rebels, with things like Stinger missiles. And so when these, some would say primitive, but they really weren't, but people living in caves for the most part, when they started shooting down Soviet helicopters with shoulder-mounted Stinger missiles, that sent a very powerful message to Moscow that, hey, this is not going to be a cakewalk. And that was largely due to President Reagan deciding to give the Soviets a hard time by arming the Mujahideen.
Yeah, and I mean, we do that with Ukraine now, too, as well, given the Ukrainians' weaponry. And I'm sure Putin is, not happy about that, of course. with us being able to use Russian soldiers as a testing ground, with us having to actually be involved. We basically did the same thing in the 80s in Afghanistan. Never forget the fact, though, that we did end up arming Osama bin Laden. So oopsies. I just love talking about American foreign policy faux pas because, yeah, we might have beaten the Soviets in Afghanistan covertly, but we also ended up arming some not desirable elements. I'll just put it that way, because we as Americans are seemingly completely incapable of not keeping our arms out of terrorists' hands.
Well, it goes back to the Future. It's in Back to the Future. Doc Brown is worrying about the Libyans trying to get nukes because at the time we didn't realize what we were doing in Afghanistan was going to have some knock-on effects. But the Soviets, to kind of get back to, I guess, what I was saying, they're stuck in the mud in their perspective, just like what we ended up doing, where they're having to juggle all these balls. I honestly kind of think that the Soviets might at least put a pause on any further at least offensive, even though they were already occupying most of Afghanistan, any kind of offensive moves in Afghanistan, because they would rather keep the house in order than try and add on an extra bedroom, so to speak. At least as of right now.
I think, too, that you have to remember that their end objective by invading Afghanistan was not Afghanistan. What do you get by taking over Afghanistan? Not a whole lot. But if you look at a map, you realize that it's not all that far. Southern Afghanistan is not all that far from the Indian Ocean. Mm-hmm. And the Soviets really wanted to make their way down to the Indian Ocean ultimately. So they would have invaded some of Pakistan eventually if they thought they could get away with it, because their goal was to get a Soviet port on the Indian Ocean.
Yeah,
as I always like to bring up,
the old Russian quest for a warm water port.
Yeah, exactly. That's what always happens here. Whenever Russia's brought up, the warm water port comes up.
Well, and to circle back to the circle back to the circle back, that brings Reagan back into the picture, because he's having to deal with Iran because of the leftovers of the hostage crisis. And right around when this martial law is not being declared in this timeline in Poland, you're also seeing Congress already having to try and lay the hammer down on Reagan and the White House for trying to, do some not so overt things with Iran and with some other potential communist hotbeds around the same time. So all of this is conflicting and flaring up right around when all these other things that we think of when we get to the later 80s are kind of just starting to germinate. So this is all tumbling in the hamster wheel at the same time.
And just to make this a very international episode, we also have in China, Deng Xiaoping, who's coming in, and he is now taking the Maoist principles and liberalizing in a lot of ways. And the Soviets are going to view him, as they do, with suspicion, thinking that he's a secret capitalist and a traitor and all those things. And already, I mean, the Soviets were never, super duper friendly with the Chinese, but Deng Xiaoping is certainly calling into question the degree to which they will remain loyal to Maoist ideology. And he's kind of doing what Gorbachev will do in a lot of respects. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure at this time, if they see, what's going on in Afghanistan, the uprising in Poland, Reagan, Thatcher, John Paul II, and now Deng Xiaoping being a little too capitalistic, you can start to see this ideological trouble brewing for the Soviets.
The old guard it's no longer a tempest in a teapot. Like, this is something that the old guard is going to want to clamp down on with, almost, if not full force, more likely than not. So, all right. So we have no martial law declared. Solidarity probably keeps continuing to gain steam. When do we think possibly the Soviets are going to invade? Maybe they, like what Dylan said, not like pull out of Afghanistan, but just like kind of keep their operations as is, defensive posture, maybe move some material over to Poland. When do we think that happens? And how do we think that Reagan and the CIA respond?
I think that by December of 81, when martial law was declared, that if it hadn't been, that we were a year, maybe two at the most, away from a Soviet or Warsaw Pact invasion to end it, because solidarity was really gaining steam. It would have continued to do so with the support of the United States and John Paul II and Margaret Thatcher. Solidarity was always, even in its earliest days, much more than just a trade union. They blossomed very early into a movement for political democracy, for freedoms of speech and press, and they were very much opposed from the start to this one-party political monopoly that the Communist Party had imposed. So they weren't going to give up. I can tell you from knowing the Polish people that they have a long history of resistance to tyranny, especially if they see any aspect of it having been foreign imposed. They would have continued to rise up, and at some point, Moscow would have said, this is a virus that's going to spread to the rest of Eastern Europe, and maybe here too, we got to put an end to it. So we were months away, a year or two at the most, from a Soviet invasion, I think, if Jaruzelski had not declared martial law.
And then what do you think would how would that, so let's just put the nail, let's just state, let's be generous. Let's say a year later, the Soviet Union invades. How do you think that would have affected solidarity? Would it have made solidarity more attractive? Would it have led the CIA to be more supportive, or would it have delayed things?
Oh, I think it would have led to a lot more support for the Polish resistance from all quarters. I remember back on the 1st of September, 1983, when the Soviets shot down a commercial airliner, KAL-007. I had a friend who was on that flight, as a matter of fact, killing almost 270 passengers. I remember that President Reagan used that as an opportunity every day. It seemed like every hour for the first full month after that, to drive home the point that this is an evil regime. It must be resisted. Its days are numbered. He had mastered the art of psychological warfare. And so many Polish dissidents and others from other parts of Eastern Europe would later say that Reagan strengthened us immensely just by his rhetoric. Here was a president who wasn't about to play footsie with the Soviets and try to be nice with them. This is one who called a spade a spade. And when we heard that, many of these dissidents later remarked, we just girded our loins for battle. We knew that the Soviets' days were numbered, and we had the support of the President of the United States. Ours was a righteous cause, and they were not going to let up.
Yeah, and I think you pose a good point too, going back to kind of what you were talking about earlier with the history of the Polish people there, because I think, especially if the Soviets full out invade, I think from the perspective of the Western democratic society, Poland represents a much better, quote unquote, rallying point around which the Western democracies can kind of come to than some dusty backwater in Central Asia where people are living in caves. The Polish people, they've only existed as a country this time for 50 years. Before that, the Soviets and the Germans invaded them in World War II. And before that, they were partitioned 3 or 4 times over the course of the 1800s. And this is, a people, especially for Americans, this is a people where lots of people's grandparents or great grandparents are still going to have memories of coming, to Ellis Island across the boat. Poland is, right in the heart of, what, especially in Washington at that time, there are going to be plenty of politicians who were veterans of the Second World War and all of that. This is going to be a much more focal incident.
Yeah.
Not that Afghanistan wasn't in terms of what happened after the Soviets invaded, but Poland, I think, is going to provoke a much more visceral and unifying reaction to support than, so even what we did in Afghanistan. I think it's going to be orders of magnitude in terms of support for Poland more than that.
Probably every American had Polish friends at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
I think there were as many or more Poles in Chicago than there were in Warsaw.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And this is actually a really fascinating point that we're developing here, because my initial thinking or understanding as we were heading into this show was, okay, Jaruzelski, General Wojak in our timeline, because he was able to suppress Solidarity, because he was able to crack down, it did lead to like kind of a delay, at least, of the inevitable for a few years, because it was like a homegrown operation. He declared martial law. He was able to brutally crack down. And while that did not remove ultimately like Solidarity and the Polish people's, desire to be free from communist influence, it did demoralize. It did put a little bit of like, the boot to the throat for a bit, made things harder to manage. If we have the Soviets coming in, like I would imagine that there would be, even possibly a stronger reaction on both the part of the Poles and internationally. Like, sure, maybe the Poles get, in reference to the General Zhao's chicken episode, like they get Tiananmen squared, but that becomes a moment, like even before Tiananmen Square happens, where you have maybe a Polish man standing in front of invading Soviet tanks, like in an era of increased liberalization and increased support for what many would probably see as like conservative, more right-wing politics around the world, anti-communist leanings. That could have been something that could have really rallied the free world a lot bigger than it did in our timeline. So all of this I'm going to say is the knock-on effects might be different than what I and maybe some of our listeners would have thought at first, because my personal opinion was if the Soviets invade, brutally crush, brutally repress, this might show the world that, okay, we're still the big boys in charge. We're still able to do mop-up duty when need be. The Eastern Bloc is as strong and unified as ever. But from what we're saying here, we might actually be seeing more of a international support and popular support for the plight of the Polish people, which could lead to increased liberalization sooner. Now, how that takes form, how that takes shape, I'm not entirely sure, because you can just look at the historical parallel of what happened with Tiananmen Square and understand China didn't really exactly rid itself of communist rule, and there wasn't as big of, a international support for what happened in China. But there's, of course, other reasons for that, things we can delve into. But I think the point that, Larry and Dylan is presenting is a very real and powerful point, that this could have been something at this particular inflection point where the West, the United States, maybe decides to more overtly support the Polish people if they see, because Reagan and the CIA were pretty well informed of the fact that the Soviets are shuffling between their crusty old dudes, and this may be their time to get a huge foreign policy win, like Iran-Contra, as Dylan put it in the pre-podcast. The Iran part of Iran-Contra is starting to bubble up. So if Reagan is like, okay, hey guys, look over here, Poland doing Polish stuff, and we're winning, maybe that's his way of kind of weaseling out of Iran-Contra a little bit.
Well, and I also think, I don't want to crap on the Soviets too much and say that like, oh, this is magically gonna send them crumbling down 5 years early. I do think as many bad things are going to happen to the Soviets because of Poland in this timeline. I think what's going to happen is the Soviets are going to exchange the sort of military image shattering that they experienced in Afghanistan. When the Soviets withdrew out of Afghanistan, this was seen as, because all throughout the 1980s, Reagan wasn't sure what to do in terms of any issues that came up in Europe, because he was getting information from some people that said the Red Army in Europe completely outclassed the United States forces that were garrisoned in Western Europe. So he's got that domino he's got to figure out. And only once the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, in our timeline, did that Soviet military might kind of crack a little bit and start to shatter a little bit. I think in this timeline, because the Soviets aren't as heavily invested in Afghanistan, getting bogged down, it becoming their Vietnam, they're there, but it's the temperature on the pot is lowered compared to what it is in our timeline. I think instead it's going to be an exposure of a political crack rather than a military crack that the Soviets are going to deal with in Poland, because it's going to be, oh, the only response that the Soviets have to the political question of, okay, what is the nature of communism? What is the nature of the Warsaw Pact? Is, the only response the Soviets have to a political question is a military response. It becomes less a question of, oh, the Soviets aren't as strong as they were. It's the Soviets aren't as together as we think they are. So like that I think gets back to the sort of Bushian, Reaganite CIA influence side of things of, okay, do you start seeing more hardcore intervention in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, some of the other Warsaw Pact states, to shift them into, to add these kinds of solidarity movements in those countries to sort of, instead of, kind of beat the Soviets outright, crack them from within over the course of the 80s.
Yeah.
Does Top Gun become a propaganda movie literally instead of a propaganda movie because airplanes are awesome?
No, I think that's a great point, Dylan. And I think one thing that we have to consider when we're talking about this political internal strife that's going on, if the Soviet Union has to invade Poland, optically, it certainly suggests that the Soviet Union is not internally united. The Warsaw Pact is maybe starting to look a little threadbare. But we also then have to consider, as a result of the milieu in our timeline, where Jaruzelski, thank you, Jaruzelski declares martial law, ostensibly, maintaining this facade of the Warsaw Pact countries are in alignment. They want to crack down on this. We're all on the same page. That maybe gives the Soviet Union, it maybe gives Moscow the desire to, or maybe not, desire is not the right word. It gives Moscow the license to allow a Gorbachevian character to come to power in 1985.
Yeah.
And he is really, we give Reagan the credit, and credit is due to him. But Gorbachev is also a key figure that officiates the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And if we have an ongoing invasion of Poland, it seems to me unlikely that we would have a Moscow willing to give Gorbachev the reins.
I think you're right. I think it would be, in fact, a much more reactionary response. Some of the hardliners of the Soviets are going to say, we can't give any inch or they'll take a mile. So we just have to go hard. We have to go. You almost see a return to some of the old Stalinist tendencies that the Soviet Union has kind of gradually been thawing from for the last 30 years.
Yeah. And so that's exactly what I was thinking as well. And so, as we start to kind of land the ship a little bit, land the plane, we can start with something that I think, based off of what we said in the pre-discussion, we all agree on, which is that this really does not affect the end of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union will end. As Larry said, it's a sclerotic regime that is doomed to fail. As such, this isn't going to affect whether the Soviet Union ends. However, it may affect how the Soviet Union ends. And instead of seeing, I guess we'll call it a bloodless dissolution of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, we may see a more violent uprising against the Soviet Union with more invasions, more top-down totalitarian tightening of the grip. But then when you tighten the grip too much, you lose control. And I'm wondering if you guys see that as how the Soviet Union ends in this alternate timeline, or whether you think things would play out more like how they did canonically. Larry, what do you think?
Well, Gorbachev represents, a new, younger generation Soviet leaders whose ideological ties to the founding of the regime were pretty frayed at that point. They were more pragmatic. He still had to contend with hardliners. In fact, you'll recall that they staged a coup against him and had him under house arrest in, when was that, August of 80 or 91?
I was going to say, yeah, it was August of 91, and this was before December of 91 when the
That's
Soviet
right,
Union
when it
officially collapsed. Yeah.
formally dissolved. So the hardliners were still around. But at some point, unless you're so hardline you can't see your hand in front of your face, you've got to recognize just by walking the streets that this isn't working, that this place is a mess, that it's the West has passed us up in every category except maybe missiles. But other than that, standard of living, I mean, they just got to the point where it was so obvious that you had to be blind, deaf, and dumb to not see 70 years of Soviet socialism having produced disaster. So that's why I kind of hope that maybe the same thing sooner or later will happen in China, that somebody will say, hey, this, Deng Xiaoping kind of had it right. And now this, what's his name, Xi Jinping, is marching us backward again. Maybe when you get another generation of Chinese leaders who are in their 40s, maybe they too will reach a point where they'll say that hardline communism just doesn't work.
Yeah. And Larry, I think you present a really excellent point of the possibility of a liberalizing China in this alternate timeline. Because when we did the General Zhao's chicken episode, where we talked about, and I forget his name right now, but the leader of China when, Tiananmen Square happened, he was more of a liberal leader and he got kicked out eventually. But really kind of what China has been able to do, because there's been a diverging path between like what happened with Russia, the collapse of communism there. China is still a communist state now, but in really functionally in name only. It's like a very heavily managed state capitalism kind of style of government today. But China basically was able to take what happened with Gorbachev and his push for both political and economic openness and reform. And they said, well, hey, look, the Soviets allowed this openness to happen, this democratization, this liberalization, and it like has kneecapped Russia. Like they lost a bunch of territory. They had like a mafia state basically for a hot minute in the 90s after, the Soviet Union collapsed. So China has been able to look at what happened in Russia and say, hey, we still need to be hardline. We still need to be, maybe not, of course, like a Maoist regime, but like we still need to have the political control. Well, maybe we'll liberalize a little more economically, but politically, it's still very much in-house. So, and China basically has said, all right, Russia tried to pursue both politics and economic liberalization, and that turned out badly for them, quote unquote. That's their argument. Therefore, we'll just maybe do a little bit of economic loosening, but still keep things very tight politically. So, Larry, I do like what you're saying in that maybe with the knock-on effects of this alternate timeline, maybe China decides earlier, or leaders in China will say, hey, let's maybe do the same thing. Let's maybe do something similar to what Gorbachev is proposing, both economic and political liberalization. Having those happen at the exact same time would be quite fascinating knock-on effects to think about.
Yeah, it does set up things to be potentially very dangerous in the interim, because let's say Xi Jinping feels his dominion at home is under threat, that people are becoming restless. That could be his excuse to invade Taiwan, to sort of rally the country to, for the cause, or what have you. So, but who knows?
Yeah, who knows? And that's what we love to do here on A Fork in Time. We'd love to think about those possible knock-on effects down the road, how that might impact things. I guess one of my parting thoughts as we kind of start closing here is I still want to know whether we get Gorbachev in a Pizza Hut commercial at some point along the line. And as Kai, as you mentioned, not to steal your thunder too much, but in the pre-podcast, you said well, if we maybe delay like the fall of communism a bit into more of the, 92, 93 timeframe, do we not have, the eloquently said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, and we instead have maybe a little bit of a less illustriously crafted phrase from President Bush at the time, which would be, read my lips, Mr. Gorbachev, no new walls. Something like
Yes,
that.
indeed.
I don't know. Whether this delays things, whether this speeds things up a little bit. I do think that just as we kind of again start coming to a close here, if the Soviets invade, repress what happens in Poland, just what ends up playing out with the rest of the 80s, I think would be very fascinating to see, both from like the Soviet response perspective and, the American response perspective. Would Bush would Bush be remembered more as the president that, like, again, saying things might be delayed a little bit, is Bush remembered more as the president, not that was the guy who like took over the reins and boom, the Soviets like just kind of fell, like when we blew on the stack of cards. Is he remembered more as being more instrumental in that, because really Reagan gets most of the credit for that.
I think Reagan deserves most of the credit. And of course, Gorbachev for not calling out the troops when he could have to quell uprisings in the Baltic states and what have you. He'd lost his stomach for that kind of activity at that point. But I remember a column that Peggy Noonan, a speechwriter for President Reagan, wrote some years ago, and she asked the question, after pointing out that everyone remembers Reagan's famous line, "Tear down this wall." Then she asked the question, does anybody remember what President Bush said when the wall actually came down? And then she went on to point out, no, nobody does. Now, you would have remembered it if Reagan had still been in office and the wall came down, because he would have gone on television and said, what a great day this is. Holy cow. I mean, he would have praised the people of East Germany for rising up against that regime. But
Reagan was a TV guy. Reagan was a TV guy. He knew a movie guy. He knew how to make it play in Peoria, as they would say.
Yeah, and he knew the value of that moment. But Bush was sort of, let's be quiet. Let's not rub their nose in it. I'm sure glad we had a more confrontational president in Reagan in the 80s than George Bush, who was quicker to want to accommodate and be a nice guy when a hard-nosed stance was what was needed and what helped to bring the Soviet Union to its knees.
Yeah. Well, Are there any other parting thoughts from the rest of the crew before we officially end things off here?
So I will take us on a long walk for a very dumb drink of water, as is my trend towards the end of episodes. As we've been talking about the end of the Soviets, the comparison that I keep coming back to is, I almost imagine the Soviet dissolution would be delayed, but what it would end up looking like at the end is almost, I keep analogizing to an exponentially larger hermit kingdom like North Korea. The Warsaw Pact is gone. The Soviets hold on to power in Russia proper for as long as they can, but it's essentially a pariah state, just like North Korea. And the reason why I'm going there is that then means that, Poland, like the rest of the Warsaw Pact, would become democratic again. And since we've talked about the Pope in this episode, and we've talked about a pizza commercial, I'm going to one-up our current Chicago Pope, because, everybody joked about when he came in office, he was going to swap the communion wine for Malort, and he was going to change the communion wafers out for deep dish. I'm going to say, instead of Gorbachev in that pizza commercial, it is John Paul II in a Polish pizza parlor.
Now that I can see 100%. I kind of am amazed that we didn't bring up his name at all during this episode, but Larry, I'm going to let you do this. The first democratically elected president of Poland.
Mazowiecki.
Yes, but I mean, with solidarity, with Poland.
Lech Walesa, sorry. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that name. Yeah. But maybe it's a joint future with him and the Pope. That could be. Who knows? But yeah, it is pretty crazy that we haven't mentioned his name. So I figured he'd be a little bit more of a prominent person in this episode. But we
And
spent
still living too. Still living. In fact, he spoke
he
in
is.
Atlanta, Georgia, here on a U.S. tour in September.
Yeah, pretty incredible. Still some people who are living who have gone through this. And I'll just say, I guess, for my last thing before we close, just for our audience's benefit, if you would like to learn more about our guest, Dr. Lawrence Reed, he is still active as the president emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education. He's still going on speaking tours, doing what he loves best, which is writing articles. And I'm going to ask Chris to put in the show notes some of Larry's work. He wrote like a tribute to the Polish people. He also, there's a few links on Fee about his journalism work in Poland in the 80s. Because like Larry, you had some run-ins with the Polish authorities, which you describe in those works. Which we didn't get into on this show. But yeah, for any of our audience who is interested in learning more about our guest, our eminently qualified guest to speak about these things, yeah, I'll link those over. Hopefully Chris will get them in the show notes for you all. But with that in mind, I think now is as good a time as any to bring this episode to a close. If we happen to encounter a fork in time, what, pray tell, do you think we should do with that?
Declare martial law and repress it.
There it is.
There's the mix, that change up that we always throw in. But for Larry's benefit, our show's tagline at the end of every episode is riff of the Yogi Berra quote. If you happen to stumble across a fork in time, what Yogi Berra said, if you come across a fork, take it. We like to say, if we come across a fork in time, take it. And that's what I think we should do here. Thank you so much for listening.
By the way, that reminds me, Evan, of another Yogi Berra line, since you mentioned time. When he was asked on more than one occasion, "What time is it, Yogi?" He would respond, "You mean now?"
Yes. Well, with this episode at an hour and 10 minutes, I think all of our audience is like, yes, the time is now. But thank you so much for indulging us, guys. I think this episode is worth a longer one if any of them really were. So yes, thank you for humoring us. If we see a fork in the road of time, I think we should take it. Thank you so much, everyone, and catch you on Discord.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.